The biggest thing that is going to disrupt your sleep are your own thoughts and your own behaviors. And until you're addressing those, most of the time, you're not getting at the root cause.
Sleepless nights aren't just a medical issue, they're often a spiritual one. Dr. Benjamin Long is a board certified sleep medicine physician who treats patients of all ages and explores where theology meets medicine. We'll get practical about sleep habits that restore rest, prayers and devotions for sleepless nights, and why fatigue mitigation matters for everyone from medical residents to everyday believers. His new Sleep Habits Journal releases December 9th, so right after you are listening to this. And this conversation connects faith, medicine, and the rest we all need. Dr. Benjamin Long, welcome to Seek, Go, Create.
I'm happy to be here.
Glad you're here too. My first question, did you get a good night's rest last night?
Oh man, of course, this is the first question you ask, you know? And this goes into a good moment. Did I get great sleep? No. Intentionally so. It was one of those nights where I turned to my wife and I was kind of like, let's go downstairs and watch a movie.
Oh no. 3 hours
So,
later.
right. Right, exactly. So, once I went to sleep, fantastic. Did I delay a little bit? Yes, yes, I did. But you
Oh
know what?
boy.
I think there's a season for everything. So,
Yeah. Don't start watching, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, director's cut, or anything like
right.
that. They never end.
Mhm.
That's cool. So it's interesting. I was just reading over some of your stuff last night and this morning, and I'm one that I sort of track my sleep with my Apple Watch. We'll talk about that later if that's a good thing to do or not. My wife makes fun of me. I don't think I'm obsessed with it, but I'm at an age where I realize, you know what? I need some rest. We'll talk later about how at one point I didn't give a rip. I was just like, I thought you could sleep when you die.
Mhm.
So I don't believe that anymore. And I went to bed well. I slept. I didn't do a wake up in the middle of the night and, do some things that some men of a certain age do. And I slept all, woke up and said, man, I'm going to get a great score. I'm going to be able to talk about that with the doctor this evening when I'm doing the podcast recording. And it just said it was restless. I didn't really get some good deep sleep, had some dreams and stuff like that. But anyway, sleep is a funny, funny thing. How did one get started with sleep being attached to what they do?
Yeah. The funny story is I entered into my residency with full plans on being a general pediatrician to the point that I was in a like breakout orientation kind of session, and one of the people who were proctoring it was a sleep medicine fellow that year, and they introduced themselves and they said, "Hey, I'm studying sleep medicine." And I was like, "Sleep? Like who would do that? That sounds so boring." And apparently 3 years later, me. I had plans to be a general pediatrician since I was like 12 years old. That's what my granddaddy did. He was a pediatrician in Columbus, Georgia. So it was kind of all that I knew. And then I was running towards that goal right at the last year before I take my boards. And I had this epiphany of, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into? I think some of that was I heard stories about what life was like as a general pediatrician when my granddaddy was practicing, and that was very different from what it is now. I went through the Air Force HPSP program, so as an Air Force pediatrician, you have a very mobile population that you're serving, and so you don't necessarily get those deep relationships like you do if you're serving in a small town kind of a thing. And then I happened to rotate on sleep, and everyone who really resonates with a specialty in medicine, you'll hear them talk about that click moment. And that was really what it was for me. My first patient, I went in and I had the whole encounter and I just realized, oh, wow, I love this. It's this interesting intersection of a little bit of neurology, a little bit of pulmonology, a little bit of psychiatry, and just all of that overlap for me was really fascinating.
And we'll talk about this in a little while. You've kind of brought in your faith and theology or this weird word I'm going to ask you about later, theosomnio, but we'll talk about it
Yeah.
later. What's interesting, I mean, this is maybe, I'm going to go big with a big question here. You may or may not have data on this, but in general, we're recording this in the United States of America, and it's late 2025. Some people may be listening to this, in the new year or whatever. We've got all these luxuries. We've got, these incredible beds and mattresses and all of this stuff. I can measure my sleep and all that. But with all that and all these other things we're going to talk about here probably in this episode, are we a sleep abundance culture, or are we
Mm.
a sleep deprived culture? And I know you might see more the people that are deprived, but just if you
Yeah.
step back and look, what would you say?
Without hesitation, sleep deprived. An area of research that I'm personally pursuing academically is looking at religiosity. So that's things like religious service attendance, personal prayer time or Bible reading, things that you can measure, and they group that together into religiosity and sleep. It's a very small area of study. I recognize I have very niche interests. And what I have been working on is some survey data that has been taken from high school seniors since like 1978. And it has all these different kind of factors, whether that's sex, where you live, socioeconomic level, parents' education, all these different factors. And religiosity or religious service attendance was one of those factors. And so the data that I haven't published yet, but have been slowly but surely getting through and working on, is that overall, no matter what, you compare how seniors responded to the survey question in 1978, and then you just look at all survey respondents to 2023, and it's definitely a downtrend. So just by year, people are seniors and that are taking the survey are not responding good sleep. So it's
Uh,
definitely a phenomenon.
so, any indications on why?
I think, yeah,
And are you guessing? Is it anecdotal data? Is it just
right.
your options? What I mean, I could guess. I think these phones have something to do with it.
Yes.
Listening to stuff, staying up all night watching TV and movies, streaming.
Yep.
How's that for doing that last night?
Yeah.
All of the above.
Right. I don't have data in front of me that I easily pull upon, but I think our screen use and really just a disconnection from that 24-hour rhythmic pattern that's just within creation. It's just an increasing disconnection from that. And that survey data from the 1970s, we've had big jumps since then. An interesting thing within the data I've been working through was there is actually an uptick from 2006 to 2012. There was a brief period where seniors were reporting better sleep. And then around 2012 or so, which also happens to be when the iPhone was really kind of getting out there more so, it starts to go down again. So, yeah, that is definitely just speculation, but there certainly is research around that. That's on for sure.
I mean, this is because we don't have a lot of data on it. I think it's speculative. But how old are you? What's your age?
I'm 35.
Okay, so I've got kids that are close to your age. I'm sitting here trying to think, and one of them actually edits this podcast, so she'll say, "You don't know my age?" I think she's 34, but that could be right or wrong. Anyway, and I'm in my 60s, and I still recall no devices, no internet, no 24/7 news, things like that. That's how old
Yeah.
I am. I know some people listening in going, "Man, what an old dude." But I also don't recall anyone talking about sleep.
Hmm.
And maybe you got some data on when it kind of became a specialty and a practice and things like that. And it's probably been around for a while,
Yeah.
but And I have these theories about things that occurred during the 80s where when CNN, I remember when it first came online and we went from, 3 channels to cable and MTV and then 24/7 news and then the internet and phones and all that kind of stuff. I have some theories about that. But when in general, I'm about to back up and I want to ask you some personal things about you growing up and things like that and how you brought these interesting topics together with your life. But do you have any history on sleep study, sleep as a medicine, as a practice, or anything like that? Because to me, it seems newer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's definitely a correct assessment in that my board certification as a board certified sleep medicine physician to be go through a fellowship. So I had to do 1 year where I devoted just to studying sleep. That didn't become really concretized until about 2012. So very new. Prior to that, it was kind of like one of those things where you read 200 sleep studies, you take a test, and you could call yourself a sleep doctor. And really, as far as age of the field, as far as when we're talking about sleep staging, like you're talking about with deep sleep, or we're talking about REM, we didn't even discover that until roughly around the 1950s or 60s, as far as the actual neurological staging of sleep. So that was really the impetus for the field and how it's kind of progressed since then.
Which probably tells us a lot why it's kind of front and center. And I don't like to throw around words like epidemic or different things like that, but I do think there's a mild crisis. I want to say like the Diet Coke of crisis. It would be like still a crisis, but just
Right.
1 calorie. We're going to come back to all that because I want to walk through a lot of the things that have gone through my mind, ask you about it, and then we want to tie in some of these spiritual components and look at this book you've written that I was able to look through over the last few days. Back up though, you say you're 35. And so, that 80s that I brought up, you came into the world at the tail end of that great generation of go, 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 greed is good. Did you have a spiritual foundation growing up? Is that something you've always had, or was that something that came later?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a preacher's kid. My dad was a bivocational preacher. It's funny, I tell people he was in the Air Force and a preacher. And so most of the time people are like, oh, so he was a chaplain? Nope, he was a pilot. He flew in the Air Force. But for a period of time, he was full time ministry for a significant portion of my childhood. So
Mm.
I like to tell people, with my grandfather being a physician, pediatrician, and my dad being in ministry as well as being in the Air Force, I just kind of spliced them together for my career ambitions. And so definitely the center of gravity for my family growing up was the church. There Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesdays, and then anywhere and everywhere in between. I have memories of being out and about with my dad while he was visiting people in the hospital, sitting with grieving people at funeral homes. Granted, most of the time I was had no interest in that as a child and outside playing in the parking lots, but definitely had a front row seat to ministry. And from a very early age, probably around fifth grade or so, I started helping out with the younger kids, and then from then on was always involved in some kind of role within the church until I left for medical school.
Mm. Did you ever consider going into full time
Yeah. This
paid ministry at all? Is that
right.
a possibility at all?
I never felt a specific call to ministry, and that was something my dad always said is, hey, if this is you will know, God will call you to this. So definitely don't do it if you don't feel called, because that's when things go awry. So yeah, my dad really instilled like a having a calling and that being kind of an important part. And there's really been a journey in some of that too of viewing my role as a physician, and that was part of this work that I've been doing that led up to writing this book was a little bit of a question: what does it look like to be a good Christian physician? Like, how exactly should my faith impact how I practice medicine? And at the beginning of my medical journey, I had one kind of viewpoint on it. I think I definitely was more along the camp of to be a good Christian physician is explicit gospel conversations with my patients and going and serving as a medical missionary, which, you know, God bless if that's something that happens. But if that is the measure of my success as a physician, I've been doing really poorly up until this point. So it really was a journey of trying to figure out, okay, what does it look like to practice in a way that is from a Christian worldview? But then also, as I decided I was going to be an expert in sleep, I found myself coming to the end of these journeys with patients, oftentimes Christians, and getting to a point where there's not necessarily a pill or a therapy or something else that I can do to fix the problem. So, of course, I am just trying to figure out, well, what's my role here then? If I can't fix the problem, what should I do? What can I do? And that question of, well, what does the Bible say about sleep? Was kind of one of the early things that came up that led me on this journey to have a fuller vision of sleep beyond what I received in my medical education.
But you mentioned earlier Columbus, Georgia, but then also Air Force. Did you move around some, or was Columbus, Georgia your base? I met my wife in Columbus, Georgia.
Oh, what?
I'm northwest of Atlanta right now as I'm recording this, and I grew up in the Atlanta area.
Okay.
And my parents, when they left Mississippi right before I was born, they came to Columbus, Georgia. So Columbus is, I don't know that I would want to go live there long term or anything like that. Columbus,
Mm-hmm.
sorry, but it's sort of special to me a little bit. So
Yeah.
was that your home? You grew up, because I know there's Fort Benning. There's not Air Force there, but there's military there.
Right.
What were you doing in Columbus?
My mom's side of the family is from Columbus. My dad, he actually started Army, did basic in Fort Benning, and then was around Columbus, and then that's how they met. He flew helicopters in the Army for a little while and then went over to the Air Force. I was actually born in Texas in Fort Worth when Carswell Air Force Base used to be open. My dad got out of the military, was in full time ministry, and that's kind of when we were in Columbus. And that's most of my childhood, like first kind of 10 years and kind of core memories there. And then in towards around 2000, they were needing more pilots in the Air Force. And so then my dad answered that call. And then we moved to Oklahoma City. We were there for about 4 years, which was also around the time of 9/11. And so my dad was involved and deployed several times. Then we moved back to Georgia when I was kind of middle school age range. So Georgia, Oklahoma were
Mm.
kind of my main childhood growing up for me. And then I went to undergrad at Columbus State University, majored in biology there. And then I went to medical school at Mercer University, but in their Savannah campus.
Savannah. I went to Georgia Tech, so I grew up in and around Atlanta and went to Georgia Tech. But one quick question before we kind of get back to the topic that I really want to talk about all of it, but I want to get back into some sleep stuff. But this actually ties in with the theology and the spiritual aspect of it. I realized at some point in my life, growing up in the Bible Belt, the Deep South, that there were a number of good things that I had, I'm going to say it this way, that had latched on to me.
Hmm.
And I also noticed that there were some things that I needed to sort of shake off. Tell me, growing up in the Deep South primarily, Oklahoma sort of counts, doesn't count, not quite.
Mm-hmm. They say
But
it counts.
Texas, you've got Georgia, you've got even deeper south than even Atlanta metro. But tell me a couple of good things about growing up in that type of atmosphere, and then a couple of things that you've had to kind of say, you know what, this wasn't necessarily good to grow up in that culture, that atmosphere.
Great question. I think a high view of scripture and the importance of scripture as God's word and a reverence for that was definitely something good. I was a Awana kid and grew up memorizing scripture. seeing it as integral to my faith. And I think that was something really good that has supported me in my spiritual journey and always something to come back to. But then as I was wrestling with this question of what does the Bible say about sleep, really helped to set a foundation for trying to get at what was actually the author's intended meaning and not trying to necessarily bring my own biases to the text as much as possible. So I think that was huge for something good. And then something I had to kind of sort through or shake off. I think a little bit of what I've already talked about as far as what does it mean to be a good physician. I love Jordan Rayner's work on a theology of work and a lot of his books. He's fantastic. And he talks a lot about how that his most recent book, The Sacredness of Secular Work, there's not this division between secular work and religious work, that all work is good. And we see that in how God worked in preparing the garden for Adam and Eve. And so having to have a more robust theology of what work meant was really important, especially while I was in my residency where I'm working 90 plus hours a week, exhausted and burnt out, and seeing all these pictures online of my friends doing all these things on social media, but then also engaging in some stuff that I was like, what am I doing? And it felt like there was this odd disconnect of, well, certainly God isn't less happy with me now in this time where I'm preparing, or what I'm doing right now be more happy with me if I was doing missions work or something of nature. Not to say that anyone explicitly said that, but most of the time in the context of my faith tradition, medical missions, medicine is seen as that means to an end to get the gospel to the person, which 100% we need to spread the gospel. Absolutely, like not dogging that at all. But it bypasses a question of, well, what does it look like for Christians who practice medicine? How should we be practicing that? That really brings back questions home to the doctors here in America and how we practice and how we engage. I could go on a whole diatribe on that.
Well, what I'm hearing, and I agree with you, that when you are in, probably in other parts of the country, my wife and I've traveled for a long time now and typically live, work, and travel in an RV. I'm actually in a real home right now as I'm recording this. And as you move around, you realize that that culture does change as you move around the country some. And and what you're talking about is in what I'll call church world most of the time. I went to Bible school for a couple of years and there's a pecking order. It's not stated, but missionary third world, there's nothing, you can't do anything more sacrificial for the kingdom of God than that. Then after that, it kind of, comes down and then you get business guy. The thing that's kind of weird for me, and the people that are listening in, they know this with me, I was saved in a business setting. I was around the Baptist church growing up in the South all my life, but it just never took. I mean, something about some of the structures and things, I just didn't care for it that much. And one of the things we talk about here, Benjamin, is kind of how business leadership and all that comes together. A little bit different than what Jordan does. He looks for people in work situations. These are like leaders, business people and all. And we really like to dig down on how do we bring all of that together in one place. And I do think sometimes traditional church circles try to make people feel less than. And I'll say it's snarky. Send your money, go out and make good money and send it in.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's interesting. I appreciate you bringing that up. I want to get back to, because obviously you did not leave some of that spiritual background behind when you became a medical professional. You brought it in, and over the last handful of years, you've been bringing it closer and closer together. It's kind of becoming one, it's becoming more synergistic. Tell me a little bit about that journey, because I think most people, a lot of our listeners will go through that. They will either be saved and start working and be really good at what they do in business, and then feel like they need to retire from that and go into full-time ministry, which might make sense at some point, but really, if you're really good at something, why not keep doing that?
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I think there's a lot of parallels with that integration journey, both for people in business as well as in medicine, in how it really impacts the questions you're asking, the methods that you are using. And so, as someone from medicine, as I said earlier, I've had this more explicit idea of what it meant to be a Christian within healthcare. And on this journey, I'm in seminary right now, trying to deepen my understanding of what it, having a Christian understanding of sleep, but then also just in this own integration journey. So there's a lot of literature on this specifically for theology and psychology, just because both of those disciplines have inherent questions of what does it mean to be human, and purpose and drive and things of that nature. And so there's it's an interesting kind of model that happens there, but I think there's probably some similarities with business as well, where we talk about theology and psychology, which we could also say theology and business, as enemies versus allies. And there's some stuff in between too. So the paradigm that I was studying for that, he also talks about spies, that you're going into one of the other territories and trying to dig what you can from it to kind of go back to help what you can. But then also you're losing some of that integrity from the other discipline. He also talks about it as kind of conquering or rebuilding or things of that nature, of saying, hey, things are so messed up in this other discipline, we need to just break everything down and start afresh from a new kind of Christian worldview or things of that nature. And then an allies model is where theology and medicine is theology is what God has revealed in his word, and then in psychology and medicine, what God has revealed in his works and creation, and what we can see and answer through scientific method and things of that nature. We're studying what God has created, and that we can bring those two things into conversation, and we'll have a better, fuller perspective of the questions that we are asking.
So, do you think if someone is struggling with bridging and or marrying their faith with their occupation, vocation, whatever, do you think it could impact their sleep?
Certainly.
Yeah. I,
Like
I think
you
I think people can get
yeah,
stressed. It's like I'm not pleasing God. Oh no.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we talk about insomnia from what's called a 3 Ps model, where you have some kind of predisposing factors, you have some kind of precipitating event that can be a stressful life event that causes the difficulty with your sleep. And then you can have perpetuating factors, where these behaviors that you're trying to respond to the insomnia that then perpetuate it. So yeah, certainly many life stressors, whether big or small, can certainly impact your sleep.
So let's dive back into the sleep. I want to tell you some things I've done, and you could either tell me, gosh, Tim, you're crazy. Usually people don't do that to the host, but I'm open to it. Okay. I really am. I mean, I'll just
Okay.
expose myself. So my wife and I have been traveling now for 13 plus years, and we've been homeless. I mean, we've been in and out of homes, but we've lived in an RV. We were in an apartment for a little while we were in Bible school and things like that. But one of the things that I've done along the way is I've wanted to see, this is kind of when I got to a place in life where I realized sleep was important. I've joked with people during the 90s, I truly believed there was no reason for sleep, and I got
Mhm.
very little of it. I was living off 3 hours a night, and who knows? Maybe I started the no sleep epidemic that might be sweeping the country now. Maybe it was me. But as I realized that I needed rest, maybe I hit about 50 years old, something like that. I actually started realizing when in certain places I slept better than others, altitudes, certain climates, when I could breathe well through my nose and when I couldn't, things like that. We would be in Breckenridge, Colorado for 6 weeks. And I would realize this, at 10,000 feet, I can't sleep. I mean,
Mhm.
I just can't. And I noticed things like that. And I started looking at temperatures. I sleep really well when it's 48 degrees outside of the covers. My wife, not so much, so that doesn't work out well. But I mean, I just experiment and play around with things. What do I do leading up to going to sleep at night? What do I do in the morning? I know that, like, over the course of, I'm not looking at one night, I'm looking at like a 3 to 5 night cumulative, rolling average, things like that.
Oh, I think you're onto something for sure. Yeah. I absolutely altitude, climate, all of those things can definitely impact the quality of the sleep that you get. And there's good research behind that as far as altitude change. We could take this conversation in 100 different ways, but certainly finding out what works for you, I think, is critical because exactly like you said, some people like it cooler, some people like it warmer. And one of the most common questions I get is, what kind of mattress should I sleep on? Or what's the best sleep position? That should I be on my back? Should I be on my side? Or all this stuff. And I'm like, whatever gets you to get the sleep that you need. And for me, that might be 7 hours. For you, that might be 8, 6. There, most people are in that 7 to 9. There are the occasional short sleepers that I think are the ones who probably have succeeded a lot in the American economy and history and stuff like that, and then just have no compassion because they're like, you need 9 hours of sleep. What are you talking about? Like 6 is all you need. So, and certainly we see that in a variety of disciplines, healthcare definitely being one of them. We're the worst patients, even though we have the most knowledge of things. And I think that finding out what works for you and understanding what it is that your body needs. So, like, if you're tracking on your Apple Watch, what's like the average sleep that you typically get on your watch?
I'm about 7 to 7.5. Pretty consistent waking up,
Yep. Yep.
you
And
know.
that's a huge thing that I always am talking about on my channel is really just trying to have that consistency of that bedtime window and not thinking that you're doing something wrong if you are getting 7, but oh, I should be getting 9 or something like that. Like, people will think that there's a certain number sometimes that they're supposed to get, but it's really what your body needs. And the best way to do that is through a wearable or just an old fashioned pen and paper and tracking kind of how much sleep you get. And then that really becomes your anchor. And then you're able to respond because life, I tell my patients this all the time, life to live is to experience precipitating factors for sleeplessness. So you're going to have something that gives you a terrible night's sleep, no matter what, if you're alive. And having that understanding of this is how much sleep I typically need or what my body does over the average of 2 weeks or so, then okay, I had a 5 hour night. I feel exhausted, but I don't want to overdo it and sleep too much the next night because then we have a terrible way of kind of swinging in one direction and overdoing it and then actually hurting our ability to fall asleep on subsequent nights.
I love the question about the mattress. I
Mm-hmm.
guess I haven't thought of this. There are some things in our current world that allow people to charge incredibly high amounts of money because people think they're supposed to. One is when people get married, for whatever reason, they throw absolutely silly money and people take advantage of that really well. Second time is when people die. when there's a death in the family. I've got friends in the funeral business, so I'm not totally dissing this business, but that's a good time to, have some money. Since you brought it up, mattresses are one too. And my wife and I were actually building a home. We traveled all over for 13, 14 years. We are about to start building a home in southern Arizona in the desert at 2,900 feet because I know that's optimal for me because I've kind of tracked it. It's kind of high desert, so it's dry and really beautiful part of the country. And there's one piece of furniture because we had some stored away that we're going to have to get, and it's our master bedroom mattress. And I've started looking around. I'm going, oh my, it has been so long since I bought a mattress. This is amazing how they're pitching this.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of money to be made there, right? Maybe we should get in the mattress business. What do you think?
Absolutely. The main research that I talked to people about was done on the firmness of the mattress for people who have low back pain. And there's small, but actually some pretty okay research that showed having about a medium firm mattress is going to be the best for your back pain. So that not too soft, too hard. Outside of that, don't have much knowledge of that.
Yeah.
And you're I think you hit the nail on the head because sleep is this growing huge industry, whether we're talking about mattresses or we're talking about supplements or we're talking about gadgets and gadgets and all this other stuff to help optimize your sleep. And I think this goes back to our conversation of thinking deeply about Christians in business and in medicine and in different industry, and what does that look like to ethically be pursuing operating in the not workplace but in the industry, being a Christian in that. And so that's one thing. Other thing is I think it also gets back to the unasked questions we get a lot of times with so many times when my patients come to me. Of course they want me to fix their sleep is the number one. They're really surprised when I don't necessarily go straight to a pill because that's what they expect me to do as a physician, is just write them a prescription. And but there is this idea that I should be able to live my life in whatever way and somehow still get the sleep that I need. And I tell patients this all the time. The problem isn't the mat. It might sometimes be the mattress. Like if you have a really old mattress, might need to get a new one. But typically it's not a new mattress. It's not a, silk lined eye mask. It's not the, you know, whatever new supplement rage is on the internet right now. The biggest thing that is going to disrupt your sleep are your own thoughts and your own behaviors. And until you're addressing those, most of the time, you're not getting at the root cause. There is a conversation that needs to be had around the marketing and the tactics and the promises that we have on that business side of the sleep industry. And there's not a lot of research to support it.
Right. I mean, there's gimmicks. I mean, something that popped in my head when you were talking about was the weighted blanket. It's like, gosh, I slept under one of those one time, and I was thinking, somebody get me out of this thing because I'm being pressed under the covers. And people say, "Oh, I love the weighted blanket." I'm going, gosh, it's like sleeping with bricks on top of you. There's a lot of gimmicks and all that. And if we were to, you called him granddaddy, and I called my grandfather from Mississippi granddaddy. If we were to bring them onto this call and have some of this conversation, they would go, "What the heck are you young fellas talking about? We just laid down on a board almost and went to
Yeah.
sleep." And my granddaddy snored, literally would shake the rafters of the house. But
Yeah.
he went to bed, he slept.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah. There's a reason why in Ecclesiastes it talks about the sleep of the laboring man. It says whether his stomach is full or is empty, his sleep is sweet compared to the rich man and his abundance. And some of that gets at a little bit of the ancient thought on sleep and related to your stomach and how full you are. I think there's something that definitely is to be said about having a good day's work. And when we were an agrarian society and we were out and we were active and we were moving, and then there's no electricity, you're just going to lay down, you're going to fall asleep.
You're going to work hard, come in, eat. You're probably not going to
Mm-hmm.
watch TV. You're not going to get up in the middle of the night and watch movies and stuff like that, or your screens, and you're going to go to sleep and
Mm-hmm.
sleep good, wake up, do it again every day, and probably not think about it that much.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I do have one, this is sort of like a practical, since I've got a doctor of sleep on, I'm going to present something that's interesting that my wife and I have, and I bet we're not the only couple that has this. And then I want to start moving into some of the spiritual aspects of sleep because that's one of the things I want us to kind of move towards and finish up with. So when I lay down here, where it is 7:23 p.m. and we're recording this, and I'm typically already starting to move into a mode where I'm getting prepared. I'll be probably by 9:30 ready to go to bed. I just got even a portable sauna that's in our bedroom. I might even do a sauna if I could get it assembled, take a cool shower and crawl in bed right after that. I mean, I'm into prepping. And I will typically lay down, read a little bit because I'm getting tired, and then I'll go to sleep and go to sleep hard. And then at about 3:37, ask me how I know that, I'll start coming out of that and I'll usually wake up. And sometimes it'll be, I start thinking about something. Sometimes I'll get up and, go to the restroom, lay back down, maybe go back to sleep, sometimes not. Anyway, my wife, she lays down, sometimes takes her an hour or so to go to sleep, takes her a while to kind of get in that mode. I don't know if it's the deep REM or whatever it is. But
Mm-hmm.
then by the time morning comes, she is sleeping hard and tough to get up. So we've got sort of opposite sleep patterns.
Mm.
Talk a little bit about anything that you want to say about what I just shared, because I think a lot of people deal with that kind of one and the other, I'm guessing.
Yeah. I think I would encourage listeners, one, to be willing to look at your options and see if there is a good sleep physician in your area, and having a full conversation on it is one. Because a lot of times people just think, like, yeah, I have some problems with my sleep occasionally, but like, what are they going to do about it? Or it's not affecting me so bad, kind of a thing. I'm getting most of my sleep, but we know if even if your body is 7 hours, that's what it needs, and you're only getting like 6.5, that is going to impact you, with your audience being entrepreneurs and people in business and things like that. There was a really interesting study that was done in 2019 that looked at sleep deprivation specifically in entrepreneurs and their ability to assess new business venture ideas. And they compared sleep deprived people with people who had reported being well rested. The interesting thing was that sleep deprived entrepreneurs were more likely to rate three different business ideas. They had a highly attractive one, normal, and a least attractive one. They were more likely to rank that least attractive one as being higher compared to their well rested counterparts. Getting the sleep that you need really can impact your ability to have that deep structural thinking and engagement in whatever your task may be. So I think having the question and being willing to go talk to a professional is always a great step number one. For me, I do 45-minute initials, and then I'm able to have a whole conversation, get your whole history, and go through that and really make sure I'm tailoring something to you specifically. And sometimes that is a little bit of a conversation or some fine tuning, but then I think it's helpful because then that's tailored to you. And you have someone else who's there walking you through it instead of going through countless Google articles or things like that and trying to piece this out on my own. So that would be one. The other thing is your circadian rhythm is pretty genetically determined. So when I say circadian rhythm, that is, you can think about that as actually your activating rhythm. You have two processes that determine your wake sleep states. Sleep pressure, or process S, is the longer you're awake, that builds. It kind of correlates with the buildup of adenosine and other byproducts in your brain that are going to make you more and more sleepy. And then as you fall asleep, then your brain starts getting rid of those things. Then on the flip side of that, you have your circadian rhythm, which is this kind of waxing and waning 24-hour pattern. If you've ever stayed awake for a full 24 hours and then you're getting to mid-morning the next day and you were really sleepy, then all of a sudden you kind of have this little burst of energy and you're like, that doesn't make sense. That's probably your circadian rhythm. And you'll feel good for an hour or two, but if you don't go to sleep soon, it's going to start tailing off and then you're going to feel really sleepy pretty soon. So that activating rhythm, when you hear people talk about chronotypes, night owls, or morning larks, or things of that nature, that's one of those things to be kind of aware of. Is there's probably a pretty significant portion of people who are true night owls, and they just cannot sleep until close to 1 or 2 a.m. And their body wants to stay asleep until closer to 10 a.m. to noon. And the problem with historically these patients has been they get labeled with insomnia and all of these other things when it's really not that. And it's a totally different treatment for that compared to true chronic insomnia. So that would be one thing for listeners if you have struggled with sleep problems for a long time and maybe you fit more of that night owl where you're just like, I'm not sleepy until 2 a.m. and then I cannot function until noon. Again, would be a great conversation to have with a sleep physician to see if that's what's it for you and there's a tailored kind of treatment for that. And I think the other thing that came up in my mind was the waking up in the middle of the night. I think we often think that I'm just supposed to sleep a full 8 hours. Waking up's normal. So the biggest thing I usually tell people is how long you're awake. So if it's less than about 15 to 30 minutes, then totally fine. Even if that is you wake up and you remember 4 or 5 nighttime awakenings. If you can flip back over and then fall back asleep, that's totally okay. But it's that waking up and I can't get back to sleep. And sometimes that waxes and wanes. And that goes back to that kind of yo-yo pattern I was talking about earlier where your body's 7 and then maybe the other day you were trying to catch up and you got like 9 hours of sleep and now you're operating out of a deficit. And so then you're going to have more nighttime awakenings because you're in a deficit. So sometimes the easiest thing is actually just tracking your sleep for a couple weeks and then trying to kind of match your time in bed to how much sleep your average sleep is. If yours, like you said, was about 7.5 hours, but you're spending 9 hours in bed, you're not being as efficient with your sleep, and you want roughly that to be 85 to 95%.
I've actually considered, it's kind of tough to do with my current schedule with some of the work I'm doing and things. I've considered just going in and getting up and doing some things. I'm working on some books and working on writing and some research and all that I'm doing right now. Getting up, starting to do some things, do some work. And then I would love it. I'm not in a position right now, but I'd love it to take about a 45-minute nap, not too long after lunchtime.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't been able to really test that well, but I'd love to. I love testing stuff and seeing what works and stuff like
Yeah.
that. I think one of the big things, and I love you wrote about it in the book we're about to talk about here, is kind of journaling and see what works. I think what a lot of people do is they try to make their life, this is another stress thing that might be where they are out of alignment. They try to make their life look like everyone else's.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a mistake. I think, first of all, is seeing what works for you. The challenge sometimes is when you sleep with someone and their schedule works different than yours. I'm pretty sure sometimes I might make a little bit of noise and my wife wants to go sleep in another room, which is something that she's able to do at times. How important is it to have I'm going to use the word peace, but that's a spiritual term. You know, when Jesus arrived, he says, my peace I bring. He said things like, my peace I give to you. You
Yeah.
know, we're not supposed to be anxious. Sometimes some of the sleep or the things I think about when I wake up in the middle of the night is stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You probably don't see people that are at peace when they come, they're fatigued. But let's start bringing in the spiritual component to this. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I think when we just look at the sleepless night as something to fix, then we miss out on the opportunity for connection and growth with God that we wouldn't necessarily just get if we're following that typical secular kind of mindset of I need 7 hours of sleep. I need to do whatever I can to kind of fix my sleep. There was a song on Christian radio back in the early 2000s that had this lyric of, what if 1,000 sleepless nights are what it takes to know you're near? There's certainly biblical narrative part of the story of God interrupting people's sleep. I think about Samuel's call to be a prophet and his waking up and not knowing what it was and going to Eli and was like, "You called for me?" And like, "Nope, go back to sleep." So I think all that to say exactly what you just said as far as the peace and the trust. Sleep within the biblical narrative gives us this level of trust and peace because we see that God is a God who never sleeps. And because of God's creator status and my creaturely status, I can lean into that vulnerability and trust him that my work doesn't actually rely on me. We convince ourselves that we're the ones in control and that I have to strive and do all this stuff. And I love to point people back to Psalm 127 that starts off about it's vain if the watchman is watching, but if the Lord's not watching, then the watchman's watching in vain. And it's vain if you are foregoing sleep, you're staying up late to work and to toil and to eat the bread of anxious toil, is how it's worded. And then in verse 2, it says, but God gives to his beloved sleep. And so, really understanding sleep as a gift from God, that's something that we can receive. That is just 100% that story and that narrative that we get from God's word, totally different from a mindset that's just built on secular humanism and that you will encounter if you go to a typical medical practice to get your sleep treated. And so there's all this, we live in an anxious and unsettled age. And to a certain extent, I can sit down with someone and talk to them about their thoughts that they're having, distortions with those thoughts, how helpful or unhelpful. We're very utilitarian and pragmatic in some ways within medicine, and that's kind of how most of the conversations go. So we're not talking about how true the thoughts are. We're talking about how helpful the thoughts are. And we can talk about replacing those with more helpful thoughts. But then that's about it. That's kind of where the therapy ends of cognitive restructuring, which is a component of cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. But then for the believer and Christian, then it goes into that next step is one of those, the thoughts that we are replacing with is the truth that we believe that God is in control and he cares for me and he loves me and cares for my sleep. And so we're able to have a different conversation about peace. And I say in my book that this journey into the sleepless night through the Bible brings more comfort and joy and peace because we are submitting our lives to the creator of those things. And so I think of when you're talking, I think a lot about Psalm 3, where David is on the run. He's fleeing from Absalom, and it kind of has this narrative that everyone's around me and they're like going to attack me. I'm surrounded. And then it has this, and then I lie down and sleep, and then I wake up, or you're with me. And which seems totally counterintuitive because his life is in danger, and yet he sleeps as this act of embodied trust. And that's the thing that I can't get past within the Bible is that level of trust of God's bigness and my smallness, that when you meditate on that and you reflect on that, are you still going to have sleepless nights? For sure. I try my best to not say, I'm going to fix your sleep. I really even try to kind of move away from better sleep. I say that occasionally and stuff, but all that to say that when we are spiritually transformed when we encounter God. And that is really the hope of this book, is to bring people's sleepless nights to God and trust that he can be trusted.
The word that popped to me, maybe God gave me the word that you wanted to say, was living a rested life, being
Mm-hmm.
just kind of at rest. And I use the word peace a lot. It's something that, and I know that that word doesn't mean it's different for different people, but it's just where everything's in alignment and I feel rested. I'm not anxious. It doesn't mean there's not a lot going on. I've got a lot going on right now. And I call this a resource that you created. I'm going to read the title and you can tell me more about what you were trying to accomplish here. Sleep Habits Journal: Practices, Prayers, and Devotions to Ease Your Sleepless Nights. First of all, tell me about the title. That's kind of cool.
Full disclosure, the publisher came up with the title.
Did they help
So,
you? I mean, it got to be a little bit collaborative. It's not like they made up something. So they had to pull something with that, though.
right. The funny story for this is actually the publisher was kind of already on the journey to create this book. They initially reached out to me and said, "Hey, can we collaborate on this?" And I was like, "Actually, can I just write it for you?" And by God's grace, and I'm so appreciative of them, they said yes. Part of that really early developmental stage that they were in was a lot of that research on the title and things of that nature. I had small input into to ease your sleepless nights, because I think previously it was restless nights, and I said, "Hey, maybe I use the sleepless night rules, so maybe we could make that kind of a thing." But truly, I think it's this amazing thing that happens in collaboration where, that the coming together of ideas, you get this better product than what you were going to have alone. Because my actual vision for this book was a full nonfiction trade book, whereas what you have is actually a gift book that's short and sweet. I like to say that they're independent, bite sized activities. And so, really, in this process, a little bit of my pride kind of came against it, because I had this idea of like, oh, I wanted to do this. But as we went through that writing process, I really saw the wisdom in it. Because in some ways, I like to say it's a book for people who hate to read, because you don't have to get through an entire chapter before you have some kind of actionable steps or things that you can do. It's written around what I call the sleepless night rules. So that way you can jump into whatever step of the rules that you're having a problem with. And in one activity, it's going to move you one little step closer on your journey through the sleepless night.
Yeah, I've got a digital copy, so I'm scrolling through it as we look. It's very attractive, by the way, the actual layout and the book and everything like that. And there was some of the steps on the sleepless night rules that was interesting to me. I might ask about it really quick. And
Yeah.
then there was first of all, I think it's if you can't go to sleep, but I'm going to kind of incorporate this into if I wake up and then can't go back to sleep.
Yep.
You say rise from bed if you cannot fall asleep and then connect with God and wait to feel sleepy.
Yeah.
Think what people do is the opposite of that usually,
Mm-hmm.
but I could be wrong. Tell me just a little bit more, and then I've got one last question before we wrap up here.
Yeah, you're right on it. Rising from bed is probably one of the hardest steps in the sleepless night rules. There is a theory that we are creating an unconscious association with the bed and wakefulness. And so when you're doing that with years and years and years, you create this association in your brain that if I'm tossing and turning and getting frustrated in bed that I can't fall asleep, then the bed becomes where I am frustrated and awake. And so rising out of bed, even just getting out of the bed and maybe in another part of your bedroom, is totally fine. For some people, they have to actually leave their bedroom. But what we're doing there is actually just trying to disconnect that association in your brain. And then part of the theology and things that I'm reflecting on in the book through that too is thinking of ourselves as more embodied, as body soul complexes. And so, what is that doing to my soul when I'm pivoting to rise out of bed, out of my frustration?
So I believe it's available next week. I believe, if we're doing our math, we're recording this a little bit earlier, but it should be right after this releases. So, anything else about where people can find it, get it, do things like that? It's kind of a journal
Mm.
aspect. There's a lot of things where people write, which I think is important for something as important as sleep. But anything else you want to say about where people can get it or things available when it's released?
Yeah, easiest place would just be going to sleephabitsjournal.com. And then that will take you straight to my website where it has all of the different vendors. But even if you just Google it or go to your typical bookseller, then you're going to be able to find it there. And yeah, I think that it's designed to be done as like self-help. Statistically, everyone who's listening knows somebody who has problems with their sleep. Pretty confident about that. So we're getting closer to Christmas time and stuff like that. And part of that, aesthetic component of it too is fantastic for a gift for someone who's really been struggling with sleepless nights. So definitely would recommend it for that too.
It does have a gift look to it. But my last question, I'm going to have you speak to someone that they listened in on this episode and they are exhausted. I know my daughter, she helps edit the podcast, so she'll probably be listening before anyone else. She's got two young children. She's married with two young children and all that that implies. And then I know that there could be some high energy, high achiever types that just operate on very little sleep. And then some people that just really struggle with some sleep things that could just be extremely tired. Just say something encouraging. Say something short and encouraging as we wrap up here, and then I'll finish up. Just something that might help them know there's hope.
Yeah, I think that is so often the person who's sitting across from me when I'm seeing you as your physician. And so I really had that in mind as I was writing the Sleep Habits Journal. Really try to create that with the tone too, to engage people where they're at. Some people will go through it and they'll have activities that don't really resonate with them, but I really tried to make sure I kept that exhausted mom, child with little ones, and they can't even remember the last night of sleep that they had and feel just out of it. And how do I get through? And I think one of the things that I love about our faith is this beautiful paradox that we worship a God who never sleeps, he never grows weary, never has need for sleep, and yet paradoxically understands our sleeplessness through the life of Jesus. And so, by the Holy Spirit who is with you in your sleeplessness, can truly actually empathize with you of what you are experiencing in your exhaustion and how tired you are. And I believe where the Spirit is, then we are moving towards some sense of healing. That could be a whole other podcast in and of itself. Of what do I actually mean by that? But what I mean is that God can be trusted as a companion on your sleepless night. And he is always present and ready to connect with you. And finding a small moment or a small breath or a small prayer may be just what you need to be able to take that first step on your journey through the sleepless night, and just know that there's a God who cares about you and empathizes with you.
That's good. Dr. Benjamin Long, thank you for this conversation. The name of the book is Sleep Habits Journal, Practices, Prayers, and Devotions to Ease Your Sleepless Nights. And again, it should be available here in the next few days. I think was it December 9th? Is that what I
That's
saw
it.
somewhere? So, and it's a good looking book for gifts and things like that. Thanks for listening in. And it's getting evening for me, man. I am just hopeful and prayerful that you will have a fantastic evening, sleepful, restful, season, this holiday season that you might be listening to this in. And I appreciate what Benjamin's doing. I do think that he is in ministry because exhausted people are not typically at rest and at peace. And it's hard for them, I believe, to really see all the things that God can do in their lives. There are seasons that we go that we might have to, go through medical school or build a business or a company or something, but do believe that he's in ministry, and I appreciate what he's doing and sharing this. So we are Seek, Go, Create. We've got new episodes every Monday. We're on YouTube, all the podcast platforms. Thanks for joining us. See everybody next week.